In a dramatic escalation of the saber rattling between Washington and Tehran, Iran has claimed responsibility for shooting down a U.S. military drone. The drone, according to the Americans, was in international waters, while Iran claims it was on its sovereign space. Regardless, a top Iranian military commander was quoted as saying that downing the drone is proof that while Iran does not, quote, intend to engage in war with any country, we are completely ready for this war. Is the world heading toward another war in the Middle East? And how will the various signatories to the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement now respond to spiraling conflict? Joining me from Ottawa, Canada via Skype is Hamed Mousavi, an Iranian professor of political science at the University of Tehran, and from Washington, D.C., Dr. Richard Weitz, a security expert at the Wikistrat Global Consultancy, a crowdsourcing platform for strategic solutions. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Dr. Weitz, let me go to you first. How serious do you think the downing of the drone really is, given the tension that has already been building up over the past months and weeks?
It's probably the most serious event so far. I mean, the other incidents, such as the mining of the navigation zones in the Gulf, the Houthi attacks on Saudi territory using missiles traced in the USU to Iran, the shelling of the territory near some U.S. facilities in Iraq. All those have been somewhat indirect. A lot of, Iran can deny that it was involved directly. But this was clearly traced to an Iranian military operation, and it was an attack on a U.S. Military platform. So it's probably the most direct and serious escalatory step we've seen so far in the crisis.
Professor Mousavi, what I quoted, this Iranian military commander who said that Iran is completely ready for this war. How do you interpret this from an Iranian perspective? Is he giving a kind of warning to deter anybody who might want to act any further, or is he just, stating the obvious? Obviously, every country should be ready for defending its country, so nothing to be, to be paid special attention to.
Right. So the Iranian leaders have been very open that they do not want a conflict with the United States, and I don't think a conflict with the United States is actually in the interests of Iran. Nevertheless, this escalation is solely the responsibility of the Trump administration. We have to remember that under Obama, the two countries were able to reach an agreement on the nuclear issue, and they signed the JCPOA. Nevertheless, it was the Trump administration that decided to withdraw over a year ago. And since then, not only have they acted on very severe sanctions on Iran, in fact, Iran is actually selling less oil today than it was prior to signing the nuclear deal in 2015. So this sort of sanctioning the Iranian economy, as well as constantly sending military equipment and troops to the region, which are essentially encircling Iran. So if you look at it from an Iranian perspective, these acts by the Americans are seen as very hostile. So although I think the two countries do not want war, however, the path we are going towards, this kind of escalation, has a chance of a so-called accidental war, where a war happens even if the two countries do not want it. And I think this is very dangerous.
Well, just over the weekend, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the United States is considering a full range of options, but he emphasized back then that President Trump does not want to go to war with Iran, and yet we are seeing this happening. Dr. Weitz, with the current tensions, do you think we're heading into some kind of military conflict, either because of miscalculation or because of intentional escalation of the tension?
I worry a lot about the miscalculation. I think that the Trump administration does not want a war with Iran. I think that they believe that the current strategy of putting a lot of pressure on Iran through sanctions, working with partners in the Gulf, trying to keep Europe and Iran and China neutral beyond declarations of concern and so on, but not actively supporting Iran. I think that they can think that time is on their side and that they have a winning strategy. Actually going to war with Iran would basically call that into question, put in a whole bunch of new factors, and probably they deem it as unnecessary. However, these kind of provocations are raising all sorts of concerns about what might come next, how this is going to appear. I mean, President Xi is now meeting with Chairman Kim in Pyongyang. Are they going to see a non-U.S. response as a sign of weakness? So a lot of other factors are going to come into play that may push the U.S. to respond in maybe a single counterstrike that could, unfortunately, raise the risk of escalation even further.
Well, until recently, Iran has reportedly held up its side of the bargain, basically sticking to the Iran nuclear deal, and yet last month Iran said it was going to do something, and most recently it has announced that it's going to start enriching uranium and break the limit that it agreed to during the Iran nuclear deal with a 10-day countdown. Professor Mousavi, what makes Iran change its mind? Is it because it's running out of patience, or does it start to put any pressure on the United States to come back to the nuclear deal, or does it really want to start repursuing nuclear weapons again?
I think this was very predictable. When the whole premise of the nuclear agreement was for Iran to restrict its nuclear program and in return get economic benefits. Now, when the Trump administration decided to withdraw from the nuclear deal over a year ago, severe sanctions have been placed on Iran, so the whole issue of getting economic benefits has gone out the door. Now, the reason Iran did not withdraw at the time, over a year ago, was because the Europeans promised that they were going to replace the benefits Iran was going to receive, even though the Americans were sanctioning Iran. However, during the past year, essentially almost all European companies have left Iran, and banking transactions have become very difficult. And as a result, Iran's patience with Europe has run out, essentially. And Iran is seeing right now that this is a unilateral agreement where Iran is doing its obligations, but the other side is essentially doing nothing, to the point that Iran is not even able to sell its own oil. So the reason Iran is withdrawing right now, I think, is very predictable. Now, we have to also consider the fact that when Rouhani, the president of Iran, came into power over 6 years ago, his whole idea was that he would improve the economy via the nuclear deal. And within Iran, the conservatives were very critical of him, saying that the Americans could not be trusted. Now, when the U.S. decided to withdraw, a lot of criticism within Iran has been raised regarding the Rouhani government.
Well, now by withdrawing from this agreement, this actually, wouldn't it give more reason for the United States to say, look, they were never sincere. This is probably going to give the U.S. more reason to put pressure on Iran. Is that going to be beneficial for the image, for the credibility of the Iranians? Dr. Weitz?
I think that's part of the U.S. strategy. I think the idea was the U.S. would deny Iran a lot of economic benefits and try and prevent other countries from subsidying for that, and basically cause Iran also to withdraw from the deal, and that would basically strengthen the tendencies of the Europeans, at least, maybe the Chinese and Russians, to adopt it's not a neutral, at least a non-active stance. And then this would basically just puts more pressure on Iran to come to what the administration wants is a better nuclear deal, something that go beyond nuclear issues
Yeah.
and cover some of the other issues in dispute between the two countries.
Yeah. Professor Mousavi, what is your take on this? Don't you think that it would be better for the Iranians to still stick to the agreement so that they at least have the moral high ground?
It's true that withdrawing from the agreement is perhaps going to give a lever to the Americans to put more pressure on Iran. However, we have to take into consideration that the Americans are increasing pressure on Iran regardless. Every few weeks they are implementing new sanctions on Iran. So I think it would be very unwise to expect the Iranians to uphold their side of the agreement when so much pressure is being raised on them. And I think Iran right now is feeling that the Americans essentially cannot be trusted. If the Americans did actually want a better nuclear deal or a larger deal, then the path would not be to withdraw from the deal, it would be to negotiate a larger deal. However, right now the Iranians are feeling, why should they negotiate with the Americans if they are not even upholding the agreement that they reached? We have to remember that the nuclear deal was a result of several years of intense diplomacy, and now it's dead, unfortunately.
Let me just play out what Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi said most recently about a Pandora's box possibly being reopened in the Middle East. Let's listen to this very quickly.
The Chinese side calls on all parties to exercise rationality and restraint, to refrain from taking any action that might escalate the situation, and to not open a Pandora's box. In particular, the United States should change its maximum pressure campaign. Unilateralism finds no support in international law and will only create bigger crises rather than solving problems.
Yeah, so Dr. Weitz, very briefly, do you think the Pandora's box is in the danger of being reopened?
Yes, slightly, but this is the Trump strategy. They like to play these kind of competitive risk-taking games or enterprises with other countries. So they've taken steps that I think many would consider risky with respect to North Korea, Iran, China, and the trade deal. And they're trying to basically, in this competitive risk-taking environment, force the other side to make more concessions than they would otherwise because of the threat of further escalation.
Okay, we'll see whether any of these tricks would produce timely and constructive results and sustainable results. I have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Hamid Mousavi of the University of Tehran and Richard Weitz of Wikistrat Global Consultancy.